Can you see my screen? It should be the slide full screen.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. And just the one slide, not the whole panel of them?
Yep, just one slide.
Okay. All right. So the talk is called Improving on Express. I'm Brian Schiller. I already gave an introduction, but I guess for the sake of the video, I work at Devotry. We are hiring for a couple of roles right now. You can find me on Twitter, GitHub, or Denver Devs, all with the same BG Schiller username. And if you want to refer back to these slides or copy some code out of them, or you want to see something from the live coding, all of that is available on GitHub at this URL. So if we're saying improving on Express, maybe we should be precise about what's even wrong with Express. There are a handful of things that I complain about. It uses callbacks for everything. And I want to give the caveat that this is kind of acceptable for Express. It wants to be backwards compatible, and it was released before promises were part of, were like natively included. We've had polyfills for a long time, but using callbacks was a reasonable choice when Express was released. There's too many ways to return from a middleware, and I'm putting return in quotes. So when you're in a middleware or a controller in Express, you can call next. You could call next and pass a parameter along, and that usually represents an error, but any value that you pass into next will actually like have a different behavior than if you just called next without an argument. It takes you to the next error middleware instead of the next middleware. You can call res.send on a response and never call next. So this is a pattern. You'll see this in the live code when we have like a requires login middleware, where if we've set up a route to require a login and no login information is passed, like there's no logged in cookie or something, we don't need to call any more of the middlewares. We want to respond to this request right away and stop the chain. We can just return without doing any of these. And I believe this ends up causing like a timeout, like just the client will time out, which is kind of a weird behavior to have in a purportedly high-level library or high-level language. Is, oh yeah, I tried to make an HTTP request, but the server was written incorrectly, so it just timed out. That is a strange thing to happen. Or you can throw an error. And in older versions of Express, throwing an error would, I think, also cause a timeout. At this point, I think that it's wrapped in a big global error catcher, so you'll get a 500, which is probably the right thing to happen. And then it's impossible to write type-aware middleware. We'll talk a little bit more about what type-aware middleware means. That's just a term I invented. But I want to pause here and see about questions. It's a little hard for me to see if hands are up. So maybe, Brooks, would you be willing to call on people on my behalf?
Yeah, if anybody has a question, go ahead and raise your hand or activate your camera and like you wave your hand or whatever, and I'll call you to talk.
It seems like there's few enough of us here that we aren't tripping over one another talking. So you can also feel free to just speak up. Okay, so we'll keep going. So this type-aware middleware thing, what is that? Let's talk about it with an example. So if you're familiar with the Passport library, you'll know that it is a somewhat common tool when you're writing an Express app, and it handles the authentication side of authentication authorization. So you can configure it to say, I want to handle I want to use HTTP basic auth, or I want to use OAuth, or like whatever your identity provider is. You set it up, and then it gives you this passport.authenticate middleware that checks that the authentication is one of the allowed methods and verifies it for you. And from that point on, you have this req.user value. There's a user property available on the request. But you should only have it, or you only get it if you included passport.authenticate. So say you have some other endpoint that is a public endpoint. Inside here, req.user should be undefined because we didn't include passport.authenticate. And what I want is I want the type system to enforce that. So I would love to be prevented from forgetting to include passport.authenticate. Or, so if I'm using req.user in here, I should get a little red TypeScript squiggly if I forgot to include this. Or if I use req.user in here, I should get a little red squiggly, and it's because I didn't want to include it, so I shouldn't be using req.user. If you think about how that would be, how to attack that, like, could we make a function like that? Could we write a type signature for for the post call, like this method in Express? It's pretty difficult because post accepts any number. It accepts a route and any number of middleware arguments. And because these all have to have the same type, it becomes really difficult to say, like, okay, if the nth was passport.authenticate, then the n plus first is going to be of a different type where req gets a different set of parameters. Like, it's just like a weird, it's not set up to work that way. Let me pause here and ask questions. All right, I'm going to go one step further, and I am going to, can I see the chat? I want to get like a thumbs up emoji if you're feeling good, and a thumbs down if you're feeling bad about it, and some other emoji if you're kind of in between.
There's the ability to do reactions down at the bottom. You can click the reaction, then leave like a thumbs up or.
Oh, I like that way better. Nice. Oh, but there's only positive ones, right?
Oh, I see clap and thumbs up. Those are the only two choices I have.
Okay. Okay. So if you're not a thumbs up, maybe give us.
Cass, you have a clap. Is that a Okay, it's thumbs up now.
Okay, sounds good. Maybe we'll think on that. And all right, I'm going to go back to the slide if I can figure out how to do it. Okay, so we've got this, we want this type-aware middleware, and we're pretty sure that the way Express is wired up, we're not going to be able to get it. So maybe we should ask at this point, how does passport.authenticate manage this problem? Oh, sorry, you can't do that. That's against the rules. So this is kind of what I was musing about earlier, is I'm pretty sure that this isn't something you can accomplish within the confines of how Express works right now. Like, this is about, if you have a variadic function, like a function that accepts any number of arguments, in order to type that, you have to say that we accept any number of arguments of this type. And I haven't found a way to do that any differently in TypeScript. There might be a more powerful type system that would let you do it, but I haven't figured it out here. So how does Passport accomplish this? How is req.user typed? It turns out, if you look in the Node modules Passport folder, there's going to be like a index.d.ts or something, and in there it's going to have some lines of code that look like this. And what this is saying is, it says within the namespace express that exists, and Passport knows it exists because it has a peer dependency, or maybe a true dependency on express. So within the express namespace, you'll find an interface request. Go ahead and add an optional user property onto that express, or onto that request interface. So that says request might or might not, because this is optional, have a user property, and its type is any. So it adds a possibly undefined req.user to every single request, regardless of whether you actually included the authenticate middleware or not. And I am not a fan. So I've done a lot of complaining up till now. Maybe at this point I should try and show what I might propose to do differently. So we've reached the live coding portion of the talk, or the first one. I'm gonna minimize this. Can I get rid of it completely? I'm not sure I can. Oh well. Okay, so I've set up this pretty minimal Express app. It has 2 endpoints, and they don't do anything yet. But we have a handful of tests for exercising these endpoints. These ones are turned off because at this point we're only going to implement the first endpoint. So let's take a look at what this looks like in like pretty good Express code. You can tell me maybe after the talk if my Express just doesn't measure up, and that's the reason I'm having all these difficulties. But I think that this is as good as it could be written. So on a post to login, we're going to pull out username and password from the body. And then we're going to grab the user by awaiting this verify login function. And this, like, these are all just kind of stubs. Like, they exist, but they're fake. Sleep for 10 milliseconds and then try and match. This is my database. Is this text large enough, by the way? All right, I got a thumbs up from a handful of people. I'm going to call it good. Ooh, and some in chat. Thanks, folks. It's really weird to do this talk with no audible feedback. If you feel up to unmuting yourself, I'd be totally fine with that. So we await verify login. The contract of this function is that it's going to always return a promise with either a user or null. And so if user is null, that means we were unable to verify the login. So if not user, return a 404. So that's going to be a res.json. Not a 404. What does that say? A 401. I hastily took some notes. But they're just by hand, and so it's kind of chicken scratch. And I think we're forgetting something. Oh yeah, we never actually verified that username and password are even there. So let's do a line like that. If not username or not password, then res.json error must include both username and password. Good deal. I'm going to ask you to unmute and shout something out if it jumps out at you as being incorrect. I'm hearing a lot of silence. Maybe someone's just being shy, but at this point, we're like, this is a good endpoint. We see no problems with this endpoint. And, you know, we shouldn't. It type checks completely. TypeScript gave us zero problems with this, so it's probably fine, right?
It doesn't return a 200? Is that what we're missing? In the case of success?
Yeah, it should return a 200. That's true too. So res.json. I don't remember what it's supposed to say. I better check. Let's check in the tests. Oh, it better set a cookie on valid credentials. That's probably it. Yeah, so we better look at that. It's even in my notes. I just couldn't read it. Good deal. All right, so TypeScript is starting to complain. What doesn't it like about this? Can someone recommend a fix for my code?
So you weren't returning inside of your invalid states, which means that as soon as it res.json status 401s, it'll keep going and there's no user there.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's exactly it. So even though this feels like a return, and this goes back to the slide I was talking about where there's so many ways to like quote return from middleware, even though this feels like a return to me, I'm thinking of it as returning all the way to the client. It isn't actually a return. So after sending this response, it would go on to try and verify the login, even though username or password were null. And then like it will continue executing code even though I think that it's returned. So let's go ahead and add returns in both of these cases, and that makes TypeScript happy. So now we're good, right? We've got no more missing returns, like Vince pointed out. We've got no more missing returns here, like Eric pointed out. Let's go ahead and run the tests. So oh, we got a lot of failures. What's it saying? It fails if username and password is not provided. Login fails if username or password is not provided. Expected a 422 unprocessable entity. Got 200 OK. Let's go back to the code and see if we can figure out. Could have sworn that we sent a 422 unprocessable entity. Anyone want to venture a guess at what's going on?
Let's see the tests again.
Sure, yeah. Do you want to see the implementation? Or sorry, like the code of the test? This
well,
is
for example, if the test did not actually provide a login or password, or it's not called username or something.
Got it. Yeah, so this is I think the test that's failing.
Yeah, so if you didn't call it username over on the other side, it's going to fail. If you call it, for example, login.
Cass has a comment. She suggests, do we need to set the status before the JSON?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. I was going to give it eventually, but I was hoping someone would grab it. Yeah, so these are order dependent. You can't just call JSON and then status. You have to call status and then JSON. What? Who designed this thing? Right? Like, who makes an API that's so easy to get wrong and so difficult to tell when it is wrong, that these should be order dependent? So it turns out that status sets up the status to be 422. JSON takes in an object, stringifies it, sets a content type header, and sends the response. So back when it was wrong, before cast set us straight, we were sending the response by the time this function returned. And then when we called status, it was already out the door. Like we couldn't set the status on a request that had already been like prepped and sent out the door. So how do we feel about that? Questions? Other fixes we should make? Should probably fix it in the other place.
Well, you know, the code, it would actually be better code if you just computed the status and what the JSON object was going to be, and then did one place at the end of the function where you actually set the status and sent it.
Not a fan of early returns.
Sometimes it's okay, but I think in this case it would get rid of your problem where you need to actually explicitly return,
Mm-hmm.
and it would sort of clean up the code.
Sure. Yeah, we've got a little bit of time, so maybe we'll change the code to see what that would look like. Do you want to guide me through it?
I would suggest basically where you have every place you have.
Sorry, I'll let you go.
200. Where you have res something, you probably would want to just set status and return object.
Okay, maybe I'll call that body.
Okay, fine.
Okay. All right, so
That also
then
reduces the number of places where you can get an ordering error.
yeah, I don't like that ordering error.
No, that's bad design.
So let's see. Then over here, we would say status is 401.
And body is,
This guy.
yep.
Then we can remove this line, remove the return. But then we still need an else in here.
And we're going to have to
Do we want like
we
a
have to have
set cookie?
yeah, there's going to have to be something about cookies.
Okay, I think. And then way out here, we can say res.cookie cookie. Is that going to cause problems for us? I don't think it will.
I don't know what will happen if you use a null.
Okay, so maybe
Yeah,
we
you
want to
can
do
cookie.
if
Cookie.
cookie res.cookie res.status status dot JSON
Body.
body. I think this passes the test also. Let's run it real quick. Or also, it turns out we forgot to run them last time. Yeah, so that passes the tests. I'm not convinced that I find this easier to read. And I'm not trying to pick on you. It's just, I'm not a fan of the like single return style. And also this interface just isn't set up to check that I'm using it correctly, right? We've got this weird if cookie thing. We now have extra levels of nesting that we didn't need when we were doing the early return. We no longer are in danger of setting the status late in multiple places, but we definitely still could once, right? There's nothing preventing me from doing this wrong.
No, there's not.
So I think this is maybe kind of a wash.
I have a question about this.
Uh-huh.
Would it be more beneficial to use middleware or different functions? And then if it passes that middleware, if it even gets to this post, then it's good to go. And we don't even need to like check to see if the username or password exists, because that could be its own middleware that gets run before.
Yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of some type of middleware that would be like check body or something like that. Or
Well, I've done this where I've used middleware that checks that the login is certain, and if the login is not valid, the middleware will just abort the request.
Isn't that what this function does? Like I definitely agree we could move it into middleware, but I'm not sure that leaves much responsibility for the controller. A decode body function would definitely be really nice, but it's unclear what I would put in here. And then like, how do I pass along the knowledge that I've decoded the body, or that I've like validated that it has the appropriate shape?
That would be that would be exactly equivalent to what you did, what we were looking at before, where if you take username and password out of req.body and you have to check it. In this case, if you wanted to do a validate body, you would just put the check for having a username and password in a middleware that would abort the request if it failed.
So something like this.
That would, I'm not sure that substantially makes things better, but that is a way to get rid of one of the conditions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to move a condition at least. It moves it into middleware instead.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, cool. I am definitely a fan of decomposing things like this. Like if we think we're going to be accepting username and password in multiple places, it would make sense to make middleware. This is the login route. I think this is probably the only place. We could move things around, argue over like small things like this for a long time. But I think we can all agree that there are some like deficiencies here. If nothing else, this is annoying. I feel like we got very little help. Like say we forget this line entirely. That's a big bug, but the type system gave us no help there. Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to drive home is that my complaints are legitimate, and I hope you'll agree. So let's move on to the next section. We are actually going to start off by making a middleware here. We're going to make a middleware called requires login. And this is one that I feel like I write in just about, or I guess what it is it's identical to passport.authenticate. So I either use passport.authenticate or I write my own requires login in just about every Express app that I work on. Let's type these guys. And what's going to go in here? I think we better find the user by ID. Oh, this better be an async function. John, I didn't mean to shut you down. Like, I agree. I think we can certainly make this code better and decompose it into smaller functions that are easier to test. I'm not sure that it actually materially improves the situation beyond making those like pieces smaller.
I mean, it's fine. Realistically, it may be slightly ugly, but it's small enough that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, sorry, I'll just keep going. So we got req.cookies.user ID, which may or may not be there, but that's okay because if it's undefined or something, then it will just fail to find it. This may or may not return a user, right? It might give us a user or it might give us null. If it gives us null, then this is one of those cases where we want to respond. And I'm not going to get fooled again. I'm going to set the status first. And then if there is a user, then we can tack it onto the request. Property user does not exist on type request. So this is where we have to do that thing where we say, no, really, an express request has a user, and this code is lifted right out of, or almost identically out of, the passport typings. If you're new to TypeScript, don't be afraid of this bit of code. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me either. And it's not something you have to write very often. Or it's, you know, like I said, I looked it up in the passport code. Okay, so this says any express request may or may not have a user on it. Why doesn't it like me now? User or null is not assignable to user or undefined. Ah, right. So instead of question mark equals, I'm just going to change this to say it might be null. Okay, so now we're happy. Are we good? Is this a good middleware? It's not a good middleware.
Got your return again, Brian.
We forgot our return again. Although in this case, it wouldn't have made a big difference, right? Because if user is undefined, then we were going to set, or if user is null, then we were going to set null to req.user anyway. Or would it have made a difference? Should it have made a difference? What else is missing?
We're not calling next.
We're never calling next. But it type checks. Why should it type check? Clearly, you know, we're not getting a lot of help.
So the thing that any program that type checks will run correctly is propaganda.
I would say it's propaganda, or it's a dream, right? Like, this is a goal we should aspire to. And if we can write libraries to support us in that direction, then we move closer to it. This is the sort of thing, this is basically a forgotten return. We should be able to get type, or like compile time verification of this. And I'm not just complaining about it. I really am going to provide a solution in a minute. Okay, so let's move on. We've got app.post talks. A talk consists of a title and a description. If not title or not description, I really did just forget the return this time, Eric. I'm not going to try and make the same mistake twice in a row. So if you don't have a title or description, that's a 422. And we're not going to forget the return this time. And if not req.user, res.status, or wait, isn't this what this is? Maybe we don't need this anymore. Okay, so we're going to create a talk. We're missing something. This is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of help I expect from TypeScript. Property user ID is missing, but it's required in create talk params. So it looks like we're going to need user ID is req.user.id. And now it's telling me req.user might be null. Okay, so maybe I need to say if not req.user, res.status, 401.json, error must be logged in. This feels very familiar. Didn't I write this code already?
Well, first you need to make sure you configure that middleware into your route.
Another thing I forgot. So let's do that too. I spelled it wrong. Okay, so I can remove this now?
Well, functionally, yes. It still might not, type checker still may not like it.
Yeah, I can remove it, but because we don't have type-aware middleware, I have to either include it so that in this portion of the function, TypeScript can tell that req.user is truthy, or I can just say, no, really, I promise it's truthy. And this always makes me feel a little bit nervous. Like, could I be lying to TypeScript here? If you're not sure, this exclamation point just asserts that it's never null. Okay, so we have our talk.
Did you actually call it req.user.id?
Req.user, yeah, I'm not messing with you in this case. Req.user is a user and it has an ID.
Okay.
Cool. And then res.json of the talk. I think this is actually correct. But there were so many places for mistakes. Like we could have forgotten this return. We could have swapped the order of these. We could have totally forgotten to include a response at the end. We might be wrong about this. Like, it was only lucky that John was paying attention enough that we happened to use our requires login function. Like, there's a bunch of things that could have gone wrong. Let's run the tests and make sure we hit all of them. Oh, I better turn the tests back on. You love to see it. 6 passing tests. Any questions on this code before I move on? Okay. So I think it's back to the slides for a minute. Nope, we went through this, live coding part 1. So what were our complaints? It uses callbacks for everything. This is kind of what we're complaining about when we say that res.json and res.status are like order dependent. It's because those are callbacks. And when we forgot to call next, it's because that's a callback. Like if middleware was written as promises, you couldn't forget to return. Or at least TypeScript would keep you from forgetting to return. So let's change our callbacks to promises. It is 2020 after all. There were too many ways to return from a middleware. So there were all those places where Eric had to remind me to include the actual return because all I had was like the response, setting up and sending the response. But then flow can continue. There's an example I had to cut from the talk because it got too long, where you are deleting a resource. And so it first does an authorization check. Are you the owner of this resource? Or if you're not the owner of this resource, send an error. But then if you forget a return in that position, it goes on with the rest of the function, which happens to be destroying the resource. So that's like a pretty important place where we would love some help. So let's remove next in favor of explicit returns. We're going to add a global error handler, which is a little easier now that we're using promises. That's going to kind of be a theme, is that everything, all the improvements we make are easier because we're using promises instead of callbacks. And it was impossible to write type-aware middleware. It was impossible to say, I checked the body, it has this shape, or there is a logged in user associated with this request, and here they are. But we can do this with promise chains. So introducing Fascia. And Fascia is a library I wrote when I was preparing this talk, actually. It kind of came out of the ideas I was exploring of like, can I make the typing more useful in Express? Where'd that name come from? Actually, it's good that Cass is on the call because she was the one who recommended you should use one of those like random JavaScript library name generators. So namer is, do you need some inspiration for which JavaScript framework you could be developing next? We're here to help. So I actually went on this website and asked it to choose me a random name. This wasn't the first one it chose, but I like it. Fascia is a sheet or band of fibrous connective tissue, separating or binding together muscles and organs. So Express middleware is sometimes called connect middleware. And binding things together is like a nice referent for a library that does this. So I said that I was going to make things better. Let's do that. The first thing I'm going to do is turn off these tests. And then I'm going to swap them. So instead of looking at baseline, they're looking at improve. But it's the very same body of tests. And then let's start writing our improvements. So instead of, oh, I'm sorry, before we do that, we're going to make an object called login params, and it's using this t.type. It's using this IOTS library. If you're unfamiliar with TypeScript, one of the constraints it has is that the types are only available at compile time. And so if you want type checking at runtime, you need to use some sort of library. And there's a couple of these. There's also one called run types. One of the main reasons that Fascia is still in alpha, or alpha is in scare quotes, because I'm the only, or actually Chris has also submitted a PR for this, is that I'm not totally sure that IOTS or run types, I'm not willing to ship before I decide which of those is better. So login params has a username, and it's a string, and it has a password, and it's also a string. And we're going to, now that we've defined this thing, we can make, what did I call it? Decode login params is decode body given the shape login params. And I'm not trying to say that this decode body is any better than one you could write for regular TypeScript so far. But check out what we can do with it. So instead of this req.res that we're used to, we're going to use a new function called with connection. And this is a function provided by Fascia. Decode body also is. So con give the with connection takes a callback. Oh, I said we were getting rid of callbacks. We're going to have just this one. And this connection, the first thing it's going to do is decode login params. And then it's going to give us a connection that is annotated, or it's improved. So it's not just a connection, it's a connection and it has a typed body. And why is it yelling at us here? It's yelling at us because the type void is not assignable to type resp. You promised you were going to give me a return value, and you never did. So let's satisfy this thing. Status code 200. I don't know if you can see the autocomplete, but it's pretty nice. Okay. So now it's a little happier with us. We're still not doing quite all of the work. So once we decode login params, then we should check if there is a user. So user is await, find user by ID. Oh, I can't use await if I'm not in an async function. No, not find user by ID. Verify login. Can I just pass con.body? I can't. I get a type error. if user isn't available, we're not just going to do some like res.json business and possibly forget to return. We're going to throw an error, not authorized. There's no question. Oh, I think I need a new. There's no question that this takes us out of the function. And are we done? We're still missing something. It hasn't solved all of our problems. We still have to set the cookie. Let me pause here and ask for questions before we run the tests. It's not obvious this is better. I'm not going to try and pretend that it is. Let's look at what happens if we forget decode login params. So if instead we just had like promise.resolve, we need a promise so we can call .then on it. If we miss decode login params, or decode, yeah, if we miss decode login params, username and password immediately tell us these don't exist. You didn't check that body, which is currently set up as an unknown. You didn't check the type of body. Let's put that back in. How do we feel? Shall I run the tests? Let's go ahead and run the tests. Getting radio silence over here. It's very unnerving.
This almost feels a little bit like dependency injection or inversion of control that you're doing.
Can you talk more about that? Let me bring the code up so you can point at things.
Yeah, so we're basically not handling this anymore, but we're passing into our routes the functions that we're using. Is that right? Or am I just not looking at it right?
I mean, there's a little bit of inversion of control when we pass this big ol' function into with connection. But I don't think of the rest of it as being related. Maybe I'm just not seeing it.
I guess I'm just thinking about the with connection part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with connection definitely sounds like inversion of control, right? Otherwise, I would just create a connection. But in this case, I'm saying, once you get a connection, here's what to do with it. I would say that's mostly just a convenience. With connection is not a particularly complicated function. I can show you, it looks like this. This is the whole thing. So that handler you passed in, it invokes it on create connection. Create connection is real dead simple. It just pulls a bunch of stuff out of the request. Oh. Yeah, let's show what would happen. Let me just finish this thought real quick. So create connection basically breaks apart req into this connection type that I've defined. It's just defined up here. Calls our handler on it. As promised, just make sure that it turns potentially a non-promise value into a promise for sure, so that we can call .catch on it, which contains our error handler. And then we fire our response, which says, it basically like converts our resp interface back into something Express knows how to handle. And if anything goes wrong, it calls next on it. So ideally, nothing would go wrong between here and here. But if we're going to be a faithful Express middleware, we should call next when something does.
Okay,
So,
that makes a lot of sense. And I guess the only other thing that can go wrong there is if you just force the typings and tell it like, oh yeah, this is totally a request without running your with connection.
where do you mean? Over here?
Yeah, so like with if you don't do the .then decode log params, if you just do your connection and then you just tell it, hey, it's totally a type connection. That way it thinks that the username and password is there when it's not.
Oh, like if I annotate this guy?
Yeah.
So actually, if I explicitly annotate it, then a connection has body typed as unknown, which is different from express. Express has it typed as any. So actually, if it would be incorrect to annotate it as connection, because really what it is a connection and a typed body.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I've never used TypeScript like that before.
Yeah. So typed body of T just says it's a connection that also that changes body from unknown into whatever type you said it was.
You extend it. Okay, I see it. David also had a question.
Yeah, let's definitely answer that. So say I chain another .then on here. So this one returned a resp. So what I get here is going to be a resp, I think. And what am I going to do with it? Say I like console.log it or something like that. Unfortunately, now the full promise chain no longer returns. So like we could do something like this. And that's allowed. Why doesn't it like that? Oh, because it's not imported. So that's fine. And it's totally happy with us here, except I need to remove this annotation. So you can definitely chain these as far as you like. And we'll see an example that chains them fairly far. But the result of the whole chain has to be a response or a resp object, or else it won't type check. Does that answer your question, David? Cool, awesome. Did we run our tests? I forget if we did. We did, and they passed. And they still will pass with this console log even. So let's work on talks. This is the last one. Oh, before we can write talks, we have to write the analog to requires login. So this is going to be a function, requires login. And what it takes, instead of being req res next, this is going to be a connection. And what it returns is going to be a promise with something. Let's figure that out later. So I'll leave it as any. So in our connection, the first thing we're going to do is find the user. So not too different from the other one. Now what's going on here? Cookies is typed, instead of being a dictionary of any, it is more correct and says, no, these are strings. And you're trying to pass it into a function that accepts numbers. So we better convert that. We were probably wrong over here too. It's just that the find user by ID must be handling it internally. But I bet this actually wanted to take a number. So if we're going to await, we better make this an async function. Once we have a user, or we might not have a user, in that case, we can throw not authorized. And then what do we do here? I think we're going to return everything on the con plus the user. So what's the type of this? This looks like a new type. And notice what I'm not doing here. I'm not saying user, or maybe it's null. What I'm saying is that if you have an auth connection, which requires login is guaranteed to return to you by the type system, or it's allowed to throw, then you definitely have a user. You don't have to we're not going to have to check it in the system, in the controller. We're not going to be able to forget to include requires login if we go ahead and use the user. This is a lot nicer. If this bothers you, this is a bit of a performance issue. If we're constantly creating new objects, there is like a pretty easy way you can get around this. You just like write a helper that actually mutates it and changes the type at the same time. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this guy. Talks takes a payload, so we're going to end up making another one of those run type or IOTS things. And talk consists of title and a description. Oh, these need to be called, I think. Do they? How did this work before? Looks like they do not. Cool, it told me right away it doesn't want to be called. And then what we're going to do with connection, given a con, we had better require login on the con, and then decode body to expect it to be the create talk payload. And then and here it's yelling at us because we're not returning. Let's just ignore that for a moment. So create talk wants a title and description. And then we're going to just return. Oh, whoops, let's do it long form first. What did we forget? Property status code is missing in the type we're returning, but it's required in the type we're supposed to return. Okay. What else is wrong? I don't have to wait for you. TypeScript will tell me. I should have marked this async. Con.body is missing the property user ID. So I should have said con.body plus user ID from con.user.id. Is it possible that could be undefined? And this could be like undefined has no attribute ID? It's not possible because we already required login. The type system is going to check us. It's going to have our back here. Let me ask questions here, and then we'll do some exploring for what happens if we forget one of these things. Okay, so let's poke at this a little bit. T.type. Thanks, Cass. Yeah, so T is from this IOTS thing, and that came from the fact that TypeScript is the type system only exists at compile time. And so in order to do checking of a payload coming in off the wire, we need to create some form of a type that lives at runtime. And IOTS, there's another one called run types. I think there's another competitor that looks cool. These all require you to write like types that look kind of like, right? The interface we would write for this in TypeScript would have been create talk payload, title, string, description, string, which looks a whole lot like this thing. But what the IOTS people say is, I know you want to write that, write this instead, and then you can get the type by asking, oh, what is it? I forget what it, hang on, it's in my slides. I can cheat. Yeah, T dot type of, is that right? And then create talk payload is going to be the TypeScript level definition. That's all happening behind the scenes inside decode body. But yeah, because TypeScript has no runtime existence, we have to do this instead of just writing a normal interface. And then David says, catching up on my TypeScript syntax and type capability, what's the type of con in here? So up here, con is a regular connection. So if we go to the adapter code, it looks exactly like this. But each of our type-aware middleware has the opportunity to tack on extra things. So requires login eats a connection, but what it produces is an auth connection, a slightly more intelligent version, one that knows that there's a user involved. And then decode body is going to take in whatever type of connection it wants, and what it spits out is an auth con with a typed body that has title and description, both strings. So by the time we get here, there is type checking for the fact that the user is logged in and the fact that the body has the shape that we expected it to have. So if we forget one of these things, say we forget to decode body, now it's going to tell us, hey, I don't know about this body thing. It's unknown and you're spreading on it. Is that allowed? Say we don't spread on it. Say we turn it back to when it was con.body. It's still going to say, hey, you said this was going to be a create talk params, but you're giving me unknown. That doesn't look right. I'm going to do that same trick. So I'm going to promise.resolve on con so that I can comment this line out more easily. What if we do have decode body, but we forget requires login? It's going to tell us there's no user. So we're like much more protected than we used to be. Say we forgot to include the status code. It yells at us. But maybe this is like too much to write all at once. This is like, it was a lot easier back when we could just write res.json talk. And it keeps auto-completing to the wrong size. Like that was way shorter. Well, we're still, this is just a plain old object. There's nothing that stops us from writing JSON talk. And if we go look at the definition of this guy, JSON is a function that takes a body of any type, and it might take an options. This one has a default value, and it returns a resp. So we can write all the helpers we want to. But I think you'll agree that this is a lot nicer than this, even though they're about the same length. We're just much more protected. Let me pause again for questions. I shouldn't have closed the chat.
One question. I notice you're mixing async await and traditional promises with .then chaining. Would you recommend doing that or just like full async await all the way down?
I tend to think that this looks really nice. The main thing that it gives us is we don't have to declare the names or types of all the intermediate values. But let's take a look at what it might look like if we did it full async await style. So if we say this is a con, then we can say
Would you have to await them?
yes, I do. Thank you. What doesn't it like about this? Huh. Luckily we have with user here. So I'm not sure why I couldn't use decoded.user ID, because we passed in an oft con.
It returns a promise, right? So I don't think you can call off, it's not like the higher order function style where you could just straight call with that. Wouldn't you have to await the decoded body and then you can call it with user?
No, decode body returns a function right away. Let me show you the definition. So it returns an async function, but it doesn't async return one. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. I thought it returned a promise.
No, it returns a function that returns a promise. Yeah, so I tend to think this is a little bit less nice. We had to come up with names. It somehow lost some of the type information for decoded. I'm not sure what it would take to get that back. We'd have to say, okay, so the type here is, we now need an explicit name for this thing. And then we need to say oftcon. Hang on, I can't see because of the videos.
Complaining about with user.
Decoder. Oh, did this parenthesize wrong? I think it did. It's not really set up for it, is what I'll say. Sorry, did someone have a suggestion for what I could do instead? With user. Maybe that's my problem, is this should be oftcon and explicit. Maybe if I call this way up here, and then instead of doing like the double call, it still doesn't like this.
Well, I didn't want to derail you too much.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think the answer is that you're better off using .then and avoiding coming up with names and explicit type annotations for these things. We don't lose any safety benefits from this, and I find it a little bit easier to read. There's just like less going on.
David also has a quote. Actually, no, Eric Whiffen had a question. How hard would it be to get TypeScript to complain if you tried to bind to post/talks twice?
So the way we're doing right here.
Yes.
Oh man, I don't think it's possible. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it's not. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but I think that you would again be looking at changing completely the way, like now you would need a framework that calls app.post for you and does type checking first. And I'm sure these things exist. Like I'm sure someone's made something that like create express app from like a big old bundle of routes. And like an object like this will completely prevent you from doing that. So I guess the answer is it wouldn't be that hard, but it would no longer look like this. Is that kind of a cop-out answer?
So is this library somehow supposed to be compatible with existing Express software?
Yeah. So that was one of my goals when I was setting out to create this is you should be able to pick this up and start using it with an existing piece of code, and don't turn it on unless a route is giving you trouble. But if you're like in there refactoring a route and you're like, oh, I wish I had type information for these things, then go ahead and use it. And so one of the things that I am working on, although it's not ready yet, is a function called from express middleware that will be exported. This is what I was working on just before the call. It is a big bear. I think this is correct, but I haven't gotten a chance to write the tests yet. But from express middleware should eat regular old express middleware and turn it into Fascia style middleware, which is like those things that eat connections and return slightly more decorated forms of connections. The one thing that this can't do automatically is it can't figure out the types for you. So you have to tell it, this is middleware that takes a regular connection and enhances it to create a oft connection or a type checked connection, like a typed body connection or something like that. But there are going to be examples of that. You should be able to use this just like const requires body is from express middleware passport.authenticate. And of course, then you'd have to add the type annotations. So you'd say something like as a function from a connection to an auth connection. So, you know, you decide if having to write the type assertion is worth it. I haven't played with this yet because, like I said, it's not finished yet. I haven't gotten a chance to write the tests.
So when I saw what you were doing, if something happens that you don't like, you just throw an error.
Yep. Yeah.
In a traditional Express middleware, you can do various things with calling next. It's fairly flexible that way. How does that fit with your just throwing the error?
We'll describe one of the things that you would do in calling next.
Well, for example, if you're going through things, you might decide you're based on who knows what's going on. I just want to call next now. I'm done with everything I'm going to do. I'm just going to call next. I'm going to return. I want an error. I'm going to return next with some error code, and then something else is going to go process based on that error code. Something else in the chain will process based on that error code.
So if you're aware of what's in your chain, you can throw like a .catch on the end of this, and I think that would accomplish about what you're describing. So that would look something like this. It would say, like, if error instance of
whatever,
like, error that I care about. So you'd want to scope this somehow.
Yeah.
Then handle it.
Otherwise, just throw.
Otherwise,
throw the error.
Throw it. Yeah. But I think that would be the Fascia equivalent of doing what you're saying. If you call next with an error, it proceeds to the following error middleware, like the next instance of error middleware.
Error middleware.
And the equivalent for that for Fascia is if you throw way up here and requires login, it proceeds to the next catch. But that's just JavaScript semantics. Like, that's not some rule you have to memorize or something you have to learn when you start using the library. So I feel like that's a little bit nicer. Now, if you want to escape completely from this with connection block, you're going to have a hard time of that because of the way it's defined. We have a global catch in here. Oh, I guess not. Yeah, no, we do have so this error handler thing. Oh no, it looks like I was smart enough to let this happen. So if you throw an error that is not one of our special controller errors, and it's not the type of error thrown by decode body, oh, nope, looks like we return here.
They just send a 500.
We just send a 500.
Reasonable.
Yeah.
That's reasonable.
Mm-hmm. But if you want a different behavior, like if you have some express error handlers or error middleware that you really like, then you could write a different version of this 5-line function that behaves more the way you want it to. The library is tiny, right? Like this behemoth of a function to convert express middleware into Fascia middleware notwithstanding, this is like about 100 lines of actual code and some interface definitions. There's not a lot going on. Most of the benefits here come from TypeScript and using promises instead of callbacks. And the rest of it is just like a few functions to wire it up. The library is nothing special. So I just have a few more things to show. Unless there are more questions, I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, so there's this PG resource thing I've been playing around with. This was originally going to ship with Fascia, but I think it's instead going to be just like a plugin or like a set of pre-built Fascia middleware. But if you have like an ORM that you like, it is very possible to write, like, define a definition for your model, and maybe this is auto-generated if you're using something like, what's that thing called? Prisma. And then you call this PG resource function. This is a connects DB because that's what I prototyped this with. You tell it what table name to attach to, and then you can call it like this. And I love this. To update a talk, send a patch request to this endpoint. You must be logged in, requires login. Look to the ID in the URL params for which talk. Item ID from URL. You must own the talk in question, must own talk. Request body must match this interface. That's our decode body. Actually do the update in the database. Talk_crud.update. And then respond with JSON, JSON from the row. So I feel like this is more powerful if we look at it in an editor that has type checking. So let's take a look at what this actually looks like. Here is our Where we had this thing. Oh yeah, here we go. To update a talk. So suppose we forget one of these things. I'm going to pull that same trick where I do. What am I doing when I do this? I'm making it so that I can comment out any particular line without breaking the fact that this is a promise chain, right? The way it was before, requires login is the thing that creates a promise. And so I'm not allowed to call .then on just a bare con. So by doing promise.resolve, it lets me comment out any line in particular. If I forgot to require login, oh, this isn't a great demo. Where should this fail? This should fail here. All right, I'll have to check into that. At one point, this failed there. I'm worried I broke something.
It looks like your editor is showing 4 errors. I wonder if those are like erroring out there before like actually checking the rest of the types.
I think you're right. I moved PG resource. It used to be part of the Fascia library, and now it's just part of the example. And I think that is exactly what's going on. So let's come back to here. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. So if you require login, must-don't-talk is going to yell at you, because how can I tell who you are if you might not even be logged in? If you forget to check must-don't-talk, I don't think it'll yell at you. This doesn't change the type at all, because this is more of like this is a policy rule more than it is like it's not something that can be checked by a type, because whether or not you own a talk there's no information missing in order to delete that. Maybe there's a way to make that a type level bug. So in that, maybe John and I are in agreement that not everything can be reduced to a type error. But say you forget to decode the body. This should yell at us. Really should. Anyway, this area is just in the examples bit, so it's not been worked on quite as often. Any questions about this or about anything? This is I guess I have a couple more slides. So drawbacks, the code is sometimes a bit longer. It relies on a pretty strong knowledge of TypeScript. We avoided talking about them just barely, but you really need to know about generics, and ideally generics with constraints, in order to write effective Fascia middleware on your own. You don't need to know it to use it, but if you want to write your own Fascia middleware, you need to know those things. And then the last drawback I would say is it's just like one more thing. What's this Fascia thing? So it can be one more thing to know. And it looks different. So if you want to give it a try, it's available on NPM. NPM install Fascia at next. You'll have to use the at next. Someone was squatting on the name, and they were kind enough to give it to me, but they'd released like an empty repo as version 0.0.1. So I'm not quite ready to release yet, so my alphas are tagged as at next. If you have ideas for improvements, hit me up on GitHub. I'd like better docs. I'd like more examples. Thank you. That is the talk.
All right. Thank you, Brian.
Any questions? Oh, I see something in chat. Oh, thank you, Cass.
Yeah, we've got claps in chat.
David says, to type check must own talk, you could possibly have talkcrod.update consume an owned talk or something. Yeah, you definitely could. The only thing is that talkcrod.update is like, I don't know, at that point you're kind of mixing business logic in with your like, how do I talk to the SQL database, which is what talkcrud does. So if you want to say every time you update a talk, which is what this talk cred function is supposed to be, you have to tag it as an owned talk. Like you could make it have type level verification. I'm not sure it would be worth the cost though. Yeah, but as David points out, it would be possible.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian, very much for this talk. This was great.
Thank you.
Where can everybody find you?
You can find me on Denver Devs. You can find me at home lately, because that's where we've all been. And then if you want to send me an email, I'm at, oops. Does this work? I am brian@brianschiller.com. If you're on Denver Devs, I'm on there fairly often in like the TypeScript, Python, JavaScript, help, most of the help-oriented channels.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. Thank you everyone for coming on out. I know this entire remote meetup thing is still pretty new, and we're all getting used to it. We are doing these talks every third Thursday. So next month we're going to have Kim Schlesinger. She's going to be talking about Nginx. And then after that, we don't have any speakers lined up yet. So if anybody wants to talk, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to get you set up. Even if you're a first-time speaker, we'll get you set up with a good talk. And I am very much happy to help out in whatever way if it's your first talk. With that, I don't really have anything else. So I hope that you all have a great night. And I'll share the links to the videos once it goes on to YouTube so you can rewatch. And with that, have a great night, everyone. And I'll see you all next time.
Thanks for hosting, Brooks.
Well, thanks, guys.
Looks like